This is crazy. This is my longest script to date, and it's a stupid, silly little Marvel show. Also, this hat's going to fall off by the end of this, and I've just come to terms with that. Jesus Christ. Agatha all along. And from this point, moving forward, I will be calling it Triple A, and or Agatha all along if I feel the need to, but I'm not going to say that the entire time. Is the best Marvel project potentially ever created, and yeah, I am biased as hell saying that. I have only seen one Marvel property since Endgame. No, it's not WandaVision before you say it. I break stereotypes here. So there's a very real chance that I am delusional. However, my need to be right is overshadowed by the love in which I have for this series. So I will still confidently say it is the best, if not one of the best. And you can argue with the wall. Now, there are many reasons why I believe this, but this video is going to center around a very specific part of why I believe this, and a very specific conversation in which I believe Agatha all along is trying to have with the viewer, and that I do think has been overshadowed by all the other different discourses on the internet. Obviously, at its crux, like, people are theorizing how this leads into the next Marvel property. Who is who from the comics, and this and that, and whatever. But I do think there's actually a much more, I don't want to say important, but fundamental narrative, I suppose, and or interesting dissection of a cultural critique in which Agatha is actually taking part in actively throughout its runtime. Agatha is about representation, something that I preach about in literally probably every video that will ever go up on this channel. Representation is so important. But Agatha goes about representation in a unique way, at least for Marvel's standards. For the first time in history, AAA goes about representing people that have been avoided by Marvel to represent, at least openly. And if not avoided, they have been in the background and or not entirely relevant to the plot. Honestly, I don't know why I'm stepping around this topic, but Marvel, especially MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe, has always been a boys' club. Honestly, the entire superhero industrial media complex is a boys' club. It's about men, and it often centers men. If women are involved, they are often sacrificed and or get limited screen time or consist of no real empirical value to the plot, at least not in comparison to her male counterparts. The most a woman can do is be badass or kick ass, which does have a place for it, obviously. And this isn't to say that Marvel is always complex either. Frankly, most Marvel properties and movies are based around the idea of who can kick ass harder, who can swing the bigger dick in the dick fighting competition. It's about who beats who in a 1v1, power scaling concepts, blah, 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 blah. But Marvel also has managed to make many men empathetic, even the objectively awful ones, from Iron Man to the Hulk, who are characters traditionally defined by one or two characteristic traits. But they both get massive amounts of development in the long MCU run that was the Endgame saga. Once again, it's not a bad thing to have stories where men lead to character development, or making bad men into good men, and bad characters into good characters, and or more empathetic characters. After all, that's literally what Agatha all along does for Agatha, a villain. They make her a villain that can be understood, but I'll get into that a little bit after. But most leads in Marvel projects who aren't men take a back seat or are one note. Don't get me started about how a billionaire who sells weapons to directly benefit multi-international terrorism gets a empathetic story before the woman whose uterus was stolen from her. That's enough said. This is essentially all to say that yes, Marvel has women leads. It has female characters who are layered, but Agatha all along, at least for myself, is the first project where these characters aren't just told to us, they are understood by us. AAA manages to be feminist and progressive leaning in so many aspects. It represents so many people that haven't gotten the representation they deserve. It's even authentic to those people, which can be good but can be bad. Authenticity, although not usually captured well in media, can be so important, especially in a tumultuous time such as our current time. At the time of creating this video, there are many conflicts going on in the world and many elections going on in the world. It's so important to get out there and vote, people. Womanhood, queerness, and people of color, all of these different minorities and demographics, their rights are up for debate. Some of these debates we haven't had for years upon years, and now we're bringing them back up again. We are all at risk of losing our rights and freedoms, and watching all the hard work that our predecessors did to secure those rights and freedoms fall right in between our hands. Now, I'm not delusional enough to say that Agatha all along is going to change the world. By no means is that what I'm going to say in this video. However, Agatha all along can shift people's perspective, especially when most people who watch Marvel tend to be in the boys club category, when the wider demographic are the people who may be the winning vote for one side or the other. It's so important that Agatha represented what it did. It is a show with almost an all-female cast, and the one person who breaks the exception is still a queer man. I'll admit, this whole video may honestly be a case of me overreading the narrative, but I also think that is so disrespectful to the writers, directors, and producers of Agatha all along, and the actors, because I think, unfortunately, I am not overreading a single thing, and I think, rather, Agatha is one of the most well-thought-out shows and or productions that Marvel has ever created. Now, in honor of discussing representation and feminism, acknowledging the shortcomings in which Agatha all along does have is important to state before I get into the actual meat and potatoes of this video. Firstly, one of the first pressing concerns I would love to discuss, I have at least seen online. There has been many conversations and discussions about Judaism and how Judaism is represented in Agatha all along. Many of the concerns I see is that it is disrespectful of them to cast a non-Jewish character for a Jewish role. Admittedly, I was conflicted about this due to my biases at first. I am happy to see any sort of gay actor get a gay role, any queer actor get a queer role. So at first, I thought this may have been an overreaction, but through a more clear mind and based less in reactionary ideology and more in empathetic ideology, when hearing these people on the internet react to Joe Locke's character in a negative way due to his lack of true Jewish representation, I realized that they weren't that far off of base, and that I, in fact, was the biased one, leading me to say that this critique is unbelievably fair. I know there are plenty of gay Jewish actors out there that could have been casted in this role and weren't. As much as I personally love Joe Locke, I think that is a fact of the matter. I always have pushed hiring queer actors and queer roles, so I think it is super fair that Jewish people should be allowed to ask for actual Jewish people in Jewish roles. I want to make something abundantly clear, though. This is not a Joe Locke problem, in my opinion. This is a Marvel problem. It is Marvel's responsibility to do their due diligence and represent the people in which the stories they are telling to a ethical degree. The actor who gets hired for a job is not to blame for Marvel's shortcoming. Yes, you can argue that Joe Locke could have shut the role down and said, no, ethically, we don't align on this. However, I can confidently say, if I was given the opportunity to be a queer actor in a queer role and show that someone like me exists to a little boy or girl in a superhero movie and show that gay and queer superheroes do exist, I probably would not have second thought it. And I probably also would have taken the job. Because it makes sense. We want to be represented. And yes, it is probably still unethical on Joe Locke's part, but I want to make it very clear that is more of a Marvel issue than a Joe Locke issue. Secondly, another critique I really can't throw my hat entirely into is the critique of Lilia's character. A lot of people have made it clear that Lilia's character leans into a lot of stereotypes and or caricatures of the idea of like a fortune teller or a word redacted that I cannot say, which is a very fair and arguably good argument. I don't know where we stand now with Lily's character getting an actual arc and being less of a character. However, I do think the beginning of Lilia was kind of mishandled, and I do understand the argument that, hey, you know, maybe we shouldn't lean into characters and archetypes of a people that have been wronged for literal centuries. That's just my thoughts. Prayers. May the Lord be with you. And also with you. Now, if you couldn't tell, this whole video is going to have spoilers. And my final critique is going to be the biggest spoiler before we've even gotten into the video. My final critique of Agatha is, this is an origin story for a man, but a series that centers women. But I hate that it ends for a man, and I think it is so incredibly wrong for it to all have just led back to one man after the stories in which we are going to talk about very soon. This video is obviously going to talk a lot about feminist ideology and progressive ideology. If you are not willing to hear that, how did you make it 10 minutes into this video? True question. Leave the answer down below. Yeah, but I think it's super gross to have a show that is supposed to at least presumably center women and be about women and on the origin story of a boy, man, Wiccan, whatever the fuck you want to call him. Yes, it's a gay man, so it's less bad, but it's still pretty insulting to do an entire show about women and witches and the different ideas I'm going to discuss soon and end it on a man. It's... With that said, let's discuss Agatha all along. Firstly, the crux of this video and the concept of this video. Something in which I feel hasn't actually been discussed is I actually think the concept of a witch in Agatha all along, at least in this specific series, obviously there's like a greater history of witches in Agatha all along, but in this series, I think it is a stand-in for the concept of feminist ideology and different types of feminism being represented in our witches. It's handled subtly, but also so on the nose in AAA. And from this point on, this will more so be a character deconstruction piece rather than an overall review of the series. And it will have heavy spoilers, as I said, with us going in order from first to die to last to die. This is because my opinion of each witch on the road is meant to represent a specific archetype of woman and or specifically women in feminism as a concept and the greater discussion. So with that being said, who's our first to die? Our green witch, Mrs. Hart. Now, I bet absolutely none of you bitches thought that none of you bitches thought anyone was going to ever make a fucking think piece on Mrs. Hart of all things. But trust and believe, I have thoughts on Mrs. Hart, and I think y'all are sleeping on her. Mrs. Hart did not do a lot and did not have a lot of airtime, frankly. Quickly, she did become a meme and then a fan favorite in the fan base, surely due to her cluelessness and, empathetic demeanor and just like sweetness. She's a sweet little old lady, man. You gotta like her. The biggest thing here is I want to tread lightly when discussing this idea of feminism because I often believe that people in which Mrs. Hart represent are often seen and or referred to as stupid and or undermined for their opinions and ideas. And I think that's an unfair argument. So I would not like to do that. But at her core, Mrs. Hart is lost. She isn't where she's meant to be. At least not in her mind, and she dies before understanding what exactly is happening around her. Yes, Mrs. Hart does represent the willfully ignorant in feminism, but she also represents those who weren't given the opportunities to learn and understand the many layers in which our world works. Those who were raised in a time period of stagnation and hopelessness for their own generation, a time period in which the only choice was to pass on the mantle to the next and live in solace. She represents both willfully ignorant, but also those without a choice of ignorance. She represents those who died along the way and never got the opportunity to understand the complexities of womanhood and feminism. Mrs. Hart is an important character due to her, frankly, forgetfulness. Many of the people in which she represents those who were on the path of feminism and women's rights who weren't in the paper or seen as a human. Rather, she represents those who endured, whether that was willingly or unwillingly. An important part of feminism is remembering that those people do exist. Being fully frank, sometimes those women are counterintuitive to our cause, but sometimes those are the women who raised the daughters who understood what they could never understand in their lifetime. Mrs. Hart represents a generational divide, that concept of I couldn't do it, but maybe those who come after me can. And it's not in a genuine way. Her screen time consists of confusion and death and or grief. And that's the reality of talking to the older people who can't bring themselves to understand the world in which we are in, some in stubbornness, but some in genuine concern and fear. This contrasts a woman who has aged so core to her and her concept of feminism, and is further built upon in our next character, Alice Wu Gulliver. This is where I say I don't have a filter on. I do have the complexion of a ghost. Not Agatha's ghost, that bitch was blue. But in fairness, I am a white person. This is an important thing to state because I believe Alice's story is very dependent on a non-white experience. Specifically has the undertone of storylines related to immigration and migration from one to another and or being a first, second, third generation immigrant and a woman of a first, second, or third generation immigrant. Alice's story is that of a story of someone who works harder than everyone else, getting nothing for it. Her stories tie back to her mother, not just for the generational curse, but the concept of being a protection witch. Even though Alice, as a person, is not entirely selfless, she has almost dedicated her life to separating herself from her mother and her story, creating her own story along the way. Her final moments are still out of selflessness. She makes a decision to save a bad person. That's the beauty of Agatha. At no point is she painted in a good way. No, she is not a good person objectively. At any time she does something good, it's to fulfill a need, a commitment, and or compensation for a previously awful action she has committed in the past. Alice is a part of this narrative. I can't speak for the children of parents who migrated from one country to another. From people I know, though, I can imagine how Alice's story can hit a soft spot, if that makes sense. That concept of being wronged by your mother, the one woman who you are supposed to be able to talk to about your struggles, of being a woman openly and honestly, and yet you resent her along the way because you can't have those discussions because of that difference in raising and culture. You resent, but you love, and that is a part of what stings. Regardless of the part of Alice's story that is so core to her, the story of being a non-white person in a culture that centers whiteness, she is still empathetic to those and so many people and women, because as we get older, even if we don't directly understand Alice's story, we do understand the concept of seeing ourselves in our parents and them in us in good and bad ways. Alice perceived her mother as this selfish person who chose fame over her, but as her character develops, she realizes her mother chose her daughter over it all, living the American dream, not for herself, but for her daughter. Alice's story tied back to generational trauma, something that many families with a history of immigration can connect with and connect to and understand, but also Alice's story is that of understanding that those who wronged you were not doing it out of malice, but primarily they can only live once, and they don't get a handbook on what choices are right. Even in death, Alice is selfish in stating how she doesn't believe her time is up. She finally understood that and corrected her mother's actions, yet that trauma and that fight would never end for her truly. She dies saving another, just as her mother did, and the circumstances are different, but the reasons are identical. Our predecessors' issues often end up on us, and we have to carry on after them. I hope I have done as much justice as I can to this storyline since I can never truly connect with the entirety of the concept of being a non-white person and the struggles that come with that. I can connect it to a personal part of my life where older people have regret, shame, and guilt about being a part of a world in which is now so, tumultuous. And they have pride in the world that they have built and the steps that they took, but when they look at people like me, they also have shame in being a part of that brick that built up some of these very hurtful systems. This concept of generations having a divide, but also an understanding for one another, is further built up in our next character, Lily Caldrew? I'm going to say Caldrew. Lily's concept of feminism is that in which is both removed and yet so tightly intertwined into the concept of feminism. She's the most self-aware witch. She has lived so many generations of witches and lived past them all. And she refuses to allow the culture in which she has watched slowly but surely die be commodified. She is the character with the most drive, the most conviction, and she needs to prove something, not just to her peers and or other witches, but to herself. A witch is not some cheap trick. It's not that of falsehood and profit. A witch is a true lifestyle. It is an ideology. It is a marginalized group of women who have persisted no matter the bumps, trials, or tribulations in which they have had to face, and or the mountains they've had to climb along the way. She is that of age, she is that of inevitability, and I think that the end of her story is something that most of us believe all of those before us were born into and hope to achieve. The dream to not have to fit a mold, the concept of a good witch, to not have to fall into the traps that those before us have succumbed to. But importantly, she loses her way due to resentment. I think Lilia, to some extent, does hold some concept of what it takes to eventually become a TERF and fall into TERF ideologies. The stubbornness of I've fought too hard for someone else to take my work for granted. It is a similar storyline to Mrs. Hart and Alice, the idea that we have been around for too long for others to profit off of our work, but what was the reason you fought then? Her dynamic with Teen further solidifies this. She is combative towards Teen's naivete due to her personal disdain for what being a witch has become in the commodification and current era. She sees depictions of Elphaba, Maleficent, and the Evil Queen, and she sees those figures as derogatory figures in fiction that have further villainized her lifestyle and her people. She's a character of trauma from the past, a past that we only get a glimpse into. However, it feels so real and raw. She has spent a life being a witch, being a woman of power, and has watched as all of the loss she has endured has been boiled down to villainous evil characters, something that can connect to a female audience, but also a queer audience. Many of us only got to see ourselves in the villains, only got to see ourselves in the evils, the antagonists to the series, the mountain you have to get over, the thing you must destroy to find true joy, happiness, and all things good. Many of us have managed to do with the assistance of therapy and medication, what Lilia Coldridge figures out in her final moments. She realizes that the way in which her life has resulted is not directly the fault of herself, nor one other person who she can put the blame onto. She accepts that the idea of being a witch may never be what she hoped it would be, and it may never be what anyone hopes it will be. But she accepts that. And that maybe no one will ever hear her warnings for the future. Maybe no one will see her as more than an old crone. At the end of the day, that's okay, because she lived her life. Maybe it wasn't the one she planned, and maybe it wasn't even the one she wanted, but it is the one that she lived. And so her final act as a witch, as a woman, is as an idiom for those who have had to fight the fight before us and before the current people. For she puts faith in those that will come after her. She believes that, yes, the world may have seen her as evil or a villain, but maybe the next generation will embrace that idea. Maybe her people were the villains, but maybe those villains will inspire the next generation of witches to be the heroes. Those villains are more than just an antagonist. They are her story. She accepts that that is a part of the life she has lived that was hers, and she accepts that those after her will keep moving forward just as she did. She accepts that the things that she hated may be the things that create a spark for the flame that come after her, of the fire of the next generation of witches. She's a story I think every adult holds dear to their heart, whether they realize it or not, that at the end of the day and at the end of our road, us, especially those who have been marginalized, and understand that we can't change the world in which we grew up in. But damn it, we certainly can try for those who come after us to make it less of a hell to live on. Maybe we won't defeat the Salem 7, but our job as the current generations is to make the world a better place for the next. That's the beauty of Lilia. Her story is not just that of a bitter old witch, but a bitter old witch who understands that the hurt in which she has endured does not need to continue to endure after her. I think it's why her sacrifice is so unbelievably moving, and why her scene has become like one of the most loved scenes of the entire series, for a character we are truly barely introduced to and get to understand. From what I can tell, everyone is so moved by Lilia's sacrifice, especially our last witch on the road, other than our core 3. Now, Jennifer Gale is one of the most on-the-nose, spot-on depictions of feminism, in the sense that, unfortunately, her character connects to one of the most truly ugly parts of feminism, as do the other women to some extent, but she feels much more impactful due to the times in which we are in. With her trial being the first trial of many, after that trial, she really doesn't get that much airtime or be a prominent character or witch. Even her trial is rather underwhelming, giving more of a predecessor to a far more plot-relevant character, Rio Vidal. But we eventually find out that Jen has more to offer than we all think, and she always has. She was so integral to the group and to the background, something her representation of feminism is known for. Jennifer Kale is a black woman in feminism, a part of feminism that has spent more time being forgotten or has had all of their trials and valor stolen to raise up other feminists rather than give credit to the true pioneer. Revolutionary and progressive ideas do not come from those of the upper class. They are not made by those who have limited challenges. They are made by those with the most against them. Those who are already at the bottom of the barrel, so it can do nothing but to benefit them to question the norms and hierarchy. It's made by those who have nothing to lose. What I'm trying to say is feminism is not a concept without black women. And yet, we often don't credit or give black women the credit for that fact. Jen's character feels almost blatantly tied to that concept, even after being the first to pass a trial and prove herself as a witch. Her coven still is more focused on the short-sighted aspects of her witchcraft. They do not celebrate those who made it through the trial and rather blame Jen for the miscomings of the trial, even though she was the only one who really could have succeeded in that trial. What's also important to state, everyone knows Jen has no magical abilities by the end, so it's a miracle she even was able to pass the first trial. It's a miracle any of them made it out, but they were all more focused on how Jen failed rather than how Jen succeeded. Rather than being given the credit, she is undermined, and not just this one time, but throughout most of the series. Something women, specifically black women in feminism and in feminist beliefs, are used to. And yet again, it feels so important to stress, I could never give this the nuance that it probably deserves. Once again, back to Alice, I truly am not probably the direct demographic for this, but I do still want to give this storyline the justice it does deserve to the best of my ability. Beyond Jen's first trial, she is often the glue of the group, helping Lilia in her journey of self-realization, heading the group into Agatha's wicked ways, into Agatha's wicked ways, and often helping in completing all of the trials, and even being the only witch who completes the Witch's Road, something that was quite literally impossible, and yet Jen achieves it. Jen throughout the series honestly has more in common than this is hard due to their lack of magical abilities, and also the method in which neither of them are entirely taken seriously by the Coven. Lilia mocks her broomstick, Agatha makes jokes about her all along the way, about her magical abilities, and she also just, in the moment, doesn't have access to her magic that was stolen by a white woman. Another important part of feminism is the concept of intersectionality, and that there is a wide history of white women sitting with men in feminism. This obviously does not solely pertain to black women and singled out. However, it feels it should be emphasized due to Jen's character arc. White women literally stole Jen's power, and not just any white woman, a white woman who has a long documented history of deception and betrayal amongst her and her other feminists, witches. This is the one thing I know I haven't interpreted incorrectly. It is so unbelievably on the nose that I am certain this was the intent of this reveal. To get to that point in which we are at in feminism, eggs had to be cracked, and now we are suffering the consequences of the eggs in which we have left behind or not given the credit to. We have never been more divided in the time in which I have personally been alive. We cannot determine what it means to be a woman who is a feminist, and so we fight amongst each other. We take from each other, and rather than determining who the oppressor is and dealing with that, we fight amongst ourselves. This isn't to say that Agatha did it for a greater good. I would hope that this video gives you the opposite impression of Agatha. Agatha was not good, and she was not good to witches, but she is a part of the system in which I would hope this video makes you see. I don't want you to like Agatha, but understand that she is an evil that is created, not born. Agatha's a character that is both my favorite and least favorite character. I think that's on purpose, though, and I would pray that, honestly, any of the characters in which I write are even half as layered and complex and empathetic as Agatha as a character. Agatha is introduced as a nasty villainous character, in which Lilia repents. She is the character with not just a history, but as Rio says, she is the witch. As the true name of her series, Agatha is there all along. She was the demise of not just witches, but covens and entire bloodlines of witches. She is the concept of evil, at least that's what the witches in her coven are led to believe, and what us, the viewer, are led to believe at first. But hopefully, as a viewer of the series and watcher of this video, I want to make something clear that what Agatha is all along is trying to say is that bad people exist. Bad people cause problems, but they are not inherently evil. Malice is not born, malice is created. It is something that I fundamentally believe, and it is something that I think is so integral to the story at the center of Agatha all along, and womanhood, feminism, queerness, and any sort of marginalized story. Representation has no room for hatred objectively, but when you mix together the background of those who think they are owed something, and mix dynamics and objectives that change from person to person, it can create problems. One selfish individual ruins it for all, and Agatha as a character is a warning to that idea and concept. Agatha has played the rules to her favor her whole life, screwing over every witch, feminist, along the way to benefit her. This is selfish, but not selfishness bred into her. It was selfishness that she learned. Through hearing Agatha's mother say that she was literally born as evil. Yes, this is a queer idiom, but we're going to talk about the gayness later with Rio. That unacceptance, that a world in which you were born into hates you for being born, that the people who are family see you as an other, that for something you cannot control. I have occasionally or personally been painted as the villain for the way in which I was born. I am proud to say that I have occasionally leaned into that persona of the gay boogeyman under the bed. For me and for some of the people I know, that was my only choice, their only choice. But for others, that's all they can do for their life. For Agatha, that was her choice. To be unaccepted, to be unloved, and to lean into that rather than give into despair. She chose to fight that fight. It was a misguided fight, but it was her only choice that she saw. That's one of the most interesting aspects of the show, is the aspect of choice and the concept of choice. Although we find out that the Witch's Road never existed, the people who did go on the Witch's Road in the series did make the choice to, and knew that they probably wouldn't survive. After all, from what is known by the rumors, Agatha is the only living witch to have gone down the Witch's Road and made it out alive. They chose that journey. That is not meant to discredit them. This video is dedicated to how much layers feminism has. It's more so how I believe the deceit of the Witch's Road is tied to the concept of modern-day feminism. This is not directly a bad thing, but believe me when I say you are being weaponized in both directions when it comes to feminism. And that feminism is a tool in which powers that be will use to benefit them in all directions. This is not directed at one government, but rather all governments. This is a fact of the government. They will pander to you, and you need to determine when they are pandering to you versus when they are looking out for you. I am not here to tell you what the questions are or what to ask, but I am telling you to ask the right questions and to be aware of that. What I can tell you is that evil is out there, but evil is made. It is manufactured. And it will find a way to survive. That's all evil knows how to do. That's why Agatha is the last witch remaining on the road. That's what her road has led to. It may not be the real witch's road, but the lessons Agatha learns along the way is the road. She has burnt so many before her, and she would continue to burn those after that she came across. She was told by her own mother that she was born evil, and for some women, specifically queer women, being taught that is so much more than being told it. It is a lesson that we must unlearn. I am not saying that queer women get a pass. No human does. However, I am saying the concept of queerness is so different depending on the culture and or ways in which you are raised. Often when it comes to queer women, there is a often belief of sexualization and more promiscuity. The concept that she is sexy, she is hot, and she is never not an option. There truly is a pendulum of representation when it comes to how each group or minority can be represented in media at a time, and that is never fair, but it is an apt statement to say that not all representation is made equally, and specifically in my time alive, women have at least in the current, probably past 10 years, been specifically wronged in which the way they could and have been represented. Agatha defies many of these concepts. She has a baby with absolutely no man, and before someone comes up and is like, there had to have been a man. Actually, empirically, Marvel has proven there doesn't have to be, because the Scarlet Witch had children, technically, without a man. Yes, you could say that the Scarlet Witch was one of a generation, but you could also very well argue that so the fuck was Agatha. She says herself, no hexes, no spells, but my child made from scratch. She worked hard to break that idea that she is evil with her child. She wants to prove that she can be a mother. Admittedly, she is not a good person, nor is she even a good mother. But when her son is alive, she fights the hardest she has ever fought for her child. Something many single mothers can probably relate to. And then, as they can also relate to, Agatha takes a breath and takes a moment of freedom and liberation, and she is punished for that. Admittedly, we will be leaning heavily into speculation from this point moving forward. However, I do think it is very accurate in speculation, and also I think that one of the big parts of Agatha all along is speculating. I think that it was intended by the writer for people to speculate about it. Agatha is presented with the opportunity when she gives birth that time is all I can give you by Rio Vidal. We, the viewer, don't understand what that means at the time, but by the end of the series, Rio Vidal, Death herself, only comes for Nicholas when Agatha doesn't kill a witch. She fought for so long, all of her son's life even, to preserve that very life. And then she allows her son to have free will and a choice not to kill, and she is punished for that. Do you understand what I'm trying to say yet? Agatha has been given fucking chances. She has pleaded her case, and she has been ignored by everyone to the day of her own child's death. The very child she killed for. The very child she dedicated her life to after. Agatha being so dedicated to this grief, she takes advantage of the reputation in which she has gained via her son. She uses the Witch's Road, something that we find out at the end of the series never existed, but she used to take witches' power. And although I think it is easy to paint Agatha as just evil and wanting to gain power, despite the awful ending of the series, I believe there is more to Agatha than just that. I see Agatha's lust for power to that of which is an addiction to substances, in which she is addicted to the concept of taking power. I believe that's why Agatha says that when she absorbs Alice's magic, she truly didn't believe she could control it. It's not that she was physically incapable, it's that she was emotionally incapable of doing so. We know she is physically capable of it, and or learned how to, and or always was, due to her absorption of Wiccan's power and keeping him alive. But I believe, just like addiction, it's not easy to stop yourself. It's not guaranteed that you can. There has been so much discourse on if Agatha could have left Alice alive or not. And obviously, with the Wiccan getting his power sucked and not dying, there has been even more discourse with that concept. But I do think it is really important to understand that Agatha's journey is that of grief, is that of struggle, and in my opinion is that of addiction. She was emotionally unable to stop herself from reaping the benefits of that power and dealing with the consequences of the actions she take is much easier than not indulging. I believe that is why the Ballad of the Witch's Road is not just a catchy tune, although it is fire, but rather it is foreshadowing and it is the depiction of Agatha's story, and as we find out, her and her son's story. Agatha has played the role of the mother, maiden, and now the crone. The series is about her descent into determining what her own personal life as a witch means, and determining that it's all led down to the Witch's Road, inevitably leading back to the person. No, the concept. No, she wasn't right to put her grief onto others, but if you have gone through grief, I can promise you, you understand the concept of wanting to put it onto other people rather than suffering yourself. You can be better, but some don't choose that route. Some feel the need to express their grief onto others and put it onto others. And Agatha spent generations not understanding that her grief was not for others to deal with. She spent a lifetime blaming her grief on the very woman who she fell in love with. Rio Vidal did not take Agatha's child. She allowed Agatha to have a loan that no one else was ever permitted. Now, Rio is very dependent on Agatha as a character, as she is more a part of Agatha's story than her own story, which I actually don't mind because it is a female-led show. That opinion will change when we get to Wiccan, just wait. But Rio is truly not a character. I mean, she is, and she has a role to play, but we find out that she is more of a concept. And by the end of the series, she is solely dependent on Agatha and her actions. Truly, I think Rio as a character is that of queer love. And yes, I mean queer love. For example, we never get an origin of Agatha and Rio, and I've seen a lot of people have an issue with that. And fair, but also, I kind of liked it, because we never understand how they met, let alone fell in love with one another. Not to quote Chaperone, but we can see that there was nothing ever casual about these two. Although, yes, much of Agatha is queer-coded, queer-adjacent, and even blatantly queer, these two are the original forbidden love. We do not know how or why, but what we do know is that Agatha is a witch born of evil, according to her mother. And at some point along the way, she came across the path of death, whether that was during the end of her life or beginning. We will never know and don't get to find out. All we know is that they are each other's one and only. Rio has broken the rules of the natural order for Agatha, ignoring her duties as death itself, not a person but a concept, to allow the one she loves to find her own version of happiness. And Agatha has spent many lifetimes appeasing Rio's necessity of death and bodies, long after her son was taken by Rio. I make this point because, yes, I mentioned the power being Agatha's addiction, but I also think that Rio was Agatha's addiction as well. Eventually, after killing enough witches, the concept of power and love, of death herself, became intertwined with Agatha as a person. Rio becomes a part of her she could never truly escape, and although we know little of what Rio's motives were, we know she was willing to take Agatha's place instead of Billy, a person who has broken the rules in which Rio claims cannot be broken. She breaks them not for her own needs, but to fulfill Agatha's wishes. I think that it is also important to discuss Rio before her reveal. This next part will somewhat be dependent on speculation, but I also think it's an important aspect of Agatha all along. Obviously, as I said, a lot of this can be speculation basically moving forward. I believe Rio Vidal's appearance in Agatha's Hex were not a part of the Hex, and were not delusions. As we see, she can break through hexes and reality-altering spells when she cuts through the Witch's Road. I believe that is the writers directly telling us, the viewer, that Rio was actually there with Agatha. Her lover didn't remember who she was, and yet Rio still stood by her delusions. What mattered to Rio was seeing Agatha, regardless of the role in which she was playing. That's all that ever has mattered to Rio. To death. She fell in love with this woman, and she was damned if a hex would prevent her from seeing Agatha again. Not only was the hex not going to stop her, but I believe, with what we know in hindsight now, Rio's question to Agatha in her delusion is so much more personal than we first thought it was. Do you remember why you hate me? This question now has so many layers from what we know. Rio wants to know if Agatha is completely under a spell, if there are parts of Rio that she still knows and understands, and more importantly, if that part of her that loves Rio is still there. She wants to know Agatha's true feelings. That's just it. Yet, Rio and Agatha have a deal, but I really don't think, from what we know, it's as simple as just a deal. Yes, Rio wishes to obviously get her bodies, but Rio also remains during the trials in which no witches perish. Rio has two true goals in mind. Her goals as a cosmic entity and being, and her goals of Rio Vidal to forever be with Agatha, no matter the stipulations. She will always break the rules for Agatha as long as it can meet her quota, a life for a life. Even in Agatha's last moments, Rio is willing to take Billy instead of Agatha, and Agatha almost willing to make that trade, considering she is so used to running from death. But something changes her. Something I really don't believe Agatha all along the series did well at expressing. Yes, there is the underlying aspect of Agatha and Teen's relationship, having a mother-son dynamic, and even Agatha confirming that she sees her own child in Billy Maximoff. However, I truly don't believe that that was enough to change Agatha. Yes, Billy uses Agatha's love for her son against her, but I truly believe that Agatha gave into her desires. She did what the show did the entirety of the airtime, and she sent the message without saying it. Agatha never in her life was willing to accept love from other women. She is in a semi-committal relationship to a woman, but she never can accept the love from that woman. She has spent her whole life from the day she was born being wronged by women she cares about, which is where the other layer of Agatha, but also Rio's relationship lies. Rio, time and time again, is willing to defy the powers above her just for her love of Agatha. Agatha could never accept that love, at least not until being questioned on her motive. Agatha, although not in the closet fully, still had spent hundreds of years being wronged by women, and starting with her mother, but also ending with the very woman she thought she could trust above all else, the very woman who chose to go against the world order for her. Agatha never experienced unconditional love, so when it was given to her, she didn't know how to handle it. So she did what most of us do. She ran. This isn't to say that Rio and Agatha should be on your Pinterest board of dream relationships or goals. However, what Rio and Agatha do have, without a doubt in my mind, is unconditional love and the inability to accept love. Agatha being wronged by so many who loved her isn't her fault to be scared of accepting that love, but it is her fault for not accepting her own issues and working on them in a relationship. Obviously, in reference to Agatha's son and his demise is a part of that. Nicholas Scratch being a child who wasn't meant to live, and then Rio breaking the rules for her, and yet still having to come and claim him, Agatha lashes out. Agatha, although being aware that there was a time limit, still is mad that that time limit happened. And despite Rio actually giving her leniency and allowing Nicholas to live for far longer than he should have, Agatha still blames Rio and still is mad at her for the leniency she was given. Agatha takes that grief and hate she feels and weaponizes it, making the choice to turn a song that was once so sacred to her and her son and using it to do the very thing that she harbored anger towards Rio for. She killed for both herself, but also for, subconsciously, Rio. As she may have not admitted it, but as we all knew, Lady Death was the woman she loved. Both loved each other without condition, which is simultaneously the ugliest but also prettiest part of their story. Rio and Agatha were in love. Agatha loved Rio as much as Rio loved her, and spent much of her very, very long life running from that fact and that knowledge and that love. That unconditional, relentless love she should have never been given. Not everyone is giving that luxury of unconditional love, at least not to Agatha's extent, which is where Agatha's final choice comes into play. It's where Rio's character shines. The setup is that Agatha must choose between herself and Wiccan. However, the truth is Agatha must choose between Rio or death unknown. At the end of all roads, Agatha always understood was Rio. When she makes that deal with Rio, she realizes there may be more out there. Agatha is puzzled with something she hasn't been puzzled with for a very long time. She must face that in which she does not know. If there is more to death than Rio, what does that mean exactly? And although I do think Agatha's sacrifice was portrayed not very well, in the method in which it was delivered, I think the messaging of it still stands. I think Agatha's sacrifice is layered. One part being obvious and being faced with the guilt of her son's death. The other part being if Agatha were to let Billy die to Rio, though she would never get to see the one person who, no matter the time and no matter the anger, grief, or sadness, always loved her. Not just because she was death, but because she was Rio Vidal, the woman who would sacrifice anything for Agatha Harkness. I believe that the moment of Billy talking to Agatha, she realizes this. I believe she finally understood the concept of unconditional love through Billy mentioning Agatha's child. She understood that her and Rio did love each other and that they were awful and wrong for that love, but that didn't matter, as she lays her final kiss on Rio Vidal, admitting defeat, not to the battle that she has fought, but to the love in which she has refused to accept. That is the importance of Rio and Agatha. They are not healthy, but they are unconditionally in love with each other. Something that anyone can find, even those who were made to be evil. And then that leaves us with the one who created the road itself, Billy Maximoff. Now, here's a character I feel lots of conflict over, and none in a good way. I like Billy's character. I even enjoy the more cringe aspects of Joe Locke. Did an excellent job. I think that they're funny, and I think they can be a great way to kill the dead air. What I don't like about Wiccan is how his character's writing is based on undermining everything I've just discussed in this video. Honestly, we'll discuss the good parts before we discuss the bad parts. Firstly, let's discuss the good parts of Billy. Alright, well, firstly, he's openly gay and happy in a loving relationship. That may sound like a low bar, but Marvel, for the infamous boys club in which it is, of only representing queer people if they're in the background or dead, it's a nice breath of fresh air. There's also a very honest treatment of him among women, which is really cool. They never at any point question or pass judgment on Billy for his gay tendencies or even cross-dressing as Maleficent. Rather, he is actually kind of celebrated in that way, which, once again, low bar, but we are talking about Marvel here, so it feels like a really, hip hip, good for you. And then, obviously, Billy being a male witch leans into the concept, kind of, if we're, sticking to this video being it all about feminism and womanhood and queerness, the concept of an idiom of a male feminist and or, like, a man in women's spaces, but not in, like, a vulture way, if you will. It also adds some poeticness, because at the end of the day, Billy Maximoff, in fact, was a vulture by the end of the series. The vulture that flipped up all of the women's stories and made it about himself. AAA had so many reveals in regards to our final three characters, but Wiccan had some of the most jaw-dropping reveals, both in a awful, horrendous way that I hated, and cute, fun way. The road being created by Billy was both a fun concept that also worked directly against the series, in my opinion. Turning a trial that was meant to challenge women and make them enable their powers and womanhood and bring them together as a group be secretly a trick of a teenager throwing a tantrum, specifically a male teenager throwing a tantrum, I think is disingenuous to the story in which was being told throughout The Witch's Road and throughout the series of Agatha all along. What makes the twist even worse, in my opinion, is that it isn't even an original twist, and rather still ties Billy back to Wanda Maximoff, something that the show can't even decide if it really wants to do. As the clear origin story for Wiccan, I cannot express to you how annoying it is to have to hear about Wanda constantly in relation to Wiccan. Yes, I understand that she is the source of his power as his mother and as his creator, yet they make his character more about Wanda Maximoff than Wiccan himself. So not only are we restructuring the concept of Witch's Road to take away from the women and awesome female representation in the show, but we are also centering a character whose story is finished, theoretically, in the MCU currently, and we're making it about someone who isn't even here. I also think it's important to mention that Billy got some of the most airtime, especially for backstory, and Billy gets, like, the most backstory out of all the characters in a show that, once again, was not painted to be about him. I don't know if this is true, but I wouldn't doubt if you went through and found out that Billy got more airtime than Agatha herself, the namesake of the show, actually got. Especially when you look at Agatha's backstory and how sloppily and poor it was done, considering it was all just redundant information which we all knew about. And then there's the ending of this series, in which we take everything in which Agatha Harkness has been through, Agatha's beginning, her growth, and her finale, where she's gained a true arc and become a true, well-rounded character, a witch of pure evil who was made, not born, a woman who couldn't be loved, a woman who couldn't love another, in her final act of love for the only two characters we've only ever seen Agatha Harkness connect to. The final fight between Agatha and Rio ends with her accepting Rio's love in a beautiful kiss, herself and that love, accepting everything that is Agatha Harkness. It cost her her life, but she saves Wiccan in the process, finally accepting what she has ran from for so long. It's a beautiful scene, although not well paced. And then it's all undermined in order to give our Disney princess, Wiccan, an animal sidekick like Mushu. They spend so much time retelling the viewer what we already know about Agatha and her story, and then just bring her back as a stupid comedic character. Agatha's treatment at the end of Agatha All Along is truly one of the reasons why I fell out of Marvel after the fact of Endgame, because the way in which you turn such a complex, interesting character into just a blue glowing version of themselves that is based more in comical relief than actual insight and storytelling is exactly how you lose me as a viewer. The worst part of Agatha all along, at least in the ending, is the reveal that it in fact was not Agatha all along, and it was Billy Maximoff all along, and that all roads actually led back to Billy. A show that was led and headed by females and by women, representing such intricate, interesting aspects of womanhood and what it means to be a woman in the modern era, and the intricacies and deception, but also the camaraderie in which you can face in those ideas in a group of women in a coven, all being undermined in order to be the origin of a man. Agatha all along is one of the best MCU creations, but also one of the worst character assassinations. One of the reasons I am so confident that this is one of, if not Marvel's best MCU projects, is because I can't wait to rewatch it. Something I have literally not thought about anything else, including some of my favorite movies like Civil War or Black Panther. Civil War and those movies had a story that was told, and it was interesting, and it was fun, but I've never needed to go back to feel like I didn't understand the story the first time, nor at least enjoyed it enough to go back to it. I truly do think Marvel is at its best when it is not focused on that power scaling, who is stronger, big, dramatic fights, yada yada. I truly do think Marvel has its best work when it is more character and story-driven, when it focuses more on the intricacies of these characters and their more emotionally complex side. That's why I liked Civil War so much. It wasn't just a movie about fights, it was a movie about the inner conflicts of the Avengers. What happens when you get these drastically political ideologies in a room with each other who have to work together. It's fascinating, and Agatha does that all along. It's so good in the way that it portrays these different people from such different walks of life, and yet all coming together for a common goal and purpose. Yes, fighting along the way, but also coming closer and understanding each other to a much deeper aspect than they ever could have without it. Even Agatha's ending, it doesn't end with some big fight, because we know at the end Agatha and Wiccan cannot defeat death. It's death itself. There is an air of inevitability. All roads lead back to her. There was never a moment in which the impression was they could defeat death. Rather, you can only run from her for so long. I really do think Agatha all along has set such a fun precedent that I hope Marvel can manage to maintain after this. The quality, the acting, the music, the set designs, almost everything about this show was perfect. With that said, the ending of the show brings my hesitation to watch any Marvel projects after it, as much as I did love this. Marvel can make such a good show and then destroy it in its beauty for the sake of making more movies and films, aka make a profit. It is the beast that can never be satiated. It is the snake that eats itself alive. There is nothing left at the end. I certainly hope Agatha is just the beginning of good and interesting Marvel stories again, but I can't promise that I'll be watching Vision Quest. I have been Enigma. Thank you for watching, and goodbye! Check all the links down below. Also, if you're interested, our side right there. Maybe you can watch it. Great. If you like this stuff, right I feel like with these, I feel like Mother, with how much I'm serving in the maiden, and with how much it hurts to walk past the photo of this look, I am in fact also the clone. Hi!